London to talk to us about medieval Islamic maps.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thank you very much, Chris, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Maps are always a combination of science, of art, of politics, of trade. They are an insight to the worldview of societies. In this case, I want to look at the history of maps within medieval Islamic civilization, medieval Islamic society, as well as the history of these maps. Maps in history, history of maps. The first maps that we know of to be made by Muslims were made in the 9th century in Baghdad. All the surviving medieval Islamic maps that we have, unlike what we've just seen in the Qatar digital project, are all in books. They are part of books, not standalone. This talk will cover 3 key map makers represented in all 3 are represented in the Bodleian collection. The first one is al-Istahri from Iran, who died in the middle of the 10th century. Then the anonymous author of the Kitab Gharaib al-Funun, or Book of Curiosities, who lived in Egypt in the first half of the 11th century, and then the famous al-Idrisi of Sicily, who died circa 1160. Each of these map makers represents a particular moment in the history of Islamic civilization. They reflect the time in which they live. I think their maps also perhaps shape the way the audiences understood the world. That's what maps are supposed to do. So we'll start with Istakhri. When Istakhri writes his geography, accompanied by maps in the first half of the 10th century, the 900s in Iran, the political situation is the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate into regional states. And he himself is not a royal cartographer or geographer. He's a freelance. He's working and traveling in the Eastern Islamic world. He comes up with a concept. Perhaps it was his master, al-Balkhi, who came up with it, but we have al-Istahri surviving. An Atlas of Islam. He has a series of 21 maps of regions of the Islamic world, only the Islamic world, plus 1 world map. And here you have a map of Syria and Palestine by al-Istakhri from a 13th century copy of the work. What does this map represent? First of all, south is at the top, and then you can see the Dead Sea and Lake Tiberias, the 2 perfect circles, and then a long list of coastal towns along the Mediterranean, which is the green space on the right. This is, of course, a completely abstract map. It's all geometric. There's no scale, no mathematical geography. But it is as handy, in a way, as a tube map, because it allows people who don't have a compass to actually plan an itinerary in the same way we plan our journeys on the tube map, because the reality of the geography of the map is different than the geography of reality. We don't need a map that represents the geographical reality on the tube in the same way merchants, rulers didn't need a map that was accurate. They needed a map that would explain to them how to plan a journey. Another wonderful map from another copy of this. And here we see Central Asia, and I think the perfect beauty of the geometrical patterns come across in this map of Central Asia, as well as the expanse of the steppe. The Aral Sea is at the bottom right, and green, as you see, green for usually salt sea, here in green. Here it is actually sweet water. And then you have mountains and rivers, all very abstract and very beautiful in my view. There is, in this world of Istachri, there is no center. Baghdad is not at the center. Mecca is not at the center. It is highlighted in the map of the Arabian Peninsula, and the map of the Arabian Peninsula is first in the series of the 21 maps. But it is not the center of the world. Mecca is not the center of the world. What you have is a reflection of an Islamic world, not an Islamic empire, not a political capital. But you have a world that is connected by this lines of the itineraries. We have a civilization here in the making that becomes divorced from any political rule. And it is quite significant that Istachri is the most successful mapmaker of the medieval Islamic world. There are more than 80 copies, and they have been studied now beautifully in a really recent book by Nadia Danilenko, which I show here. Why has Istachri been so successful? I think there are two main reasons. One is that there is a power of abstraction in the same way the tube map is so successful. Abstractions capture our imagination and are easy to copy as well. The other reason Istachri was so successful is I think that his maps are of the time of the golden age of the Abbasid civilization, and later generations saw them as a focus of nostalgia. This is the great past. This is the world of the Abbasids. This is the Abbasid world which we have lost. This is the formation of Islam. And I think that's another reason why he has been copied so many times, over 80 copies in later centuries. Now the next map maker is anonymous. It's come to light when my colleague and my mentor, Professor Emily Savage-Smith of Oxford, came to visit Christie's in October 2000. And she was shown this manuscript with a cover with a famous bird dropping on it. And it had a series of very strange diagrams and maps, text as well, but over 20 diagrams and maps. And one of the most exciting, strange looking was that one. And it took a few days to understand what this could mean. Slowly the Arabic was deciphered. This is the top we have a Sina or Arsenal, a nice onion dome for the palace of the Sultan and his slaves, the palace of the chain. After a couple of days, they realized this is Sicily as it appeared or as it existed under Muslim Fatimid rule, circa 1000. When we have on the bottom left, we have a mountain with a red cap. That is Mount Etna. And the city with its gates in the middle, so prominent, is of course Palermo. And some of the gates still stand with the names here. They still stand today in Palermo. So this is a map in which we have still abstraction, but a bit more mimetic representation of reality, a few more iconography like the Sultan's palace. As research on this developed, a few things came across from the text, that the author lived in Egypt in the first half of the 11th century, that he was definitely a Fatimid subject, and that the copy that the Bodleian eventually came to purchase with the help of many bodies and friends of the Bodleian was copied sometime later, according to the paper in the script in the beginning of the 13th century. And here you have another map that shows how unlike Istachi that we've seen before, this author was more mimetic, was less abstract, although keeping to the general abstraction of Istachi. And here in Mahdia, at the coast of modern Tunisia, as well as Sicily, much more interested in seaways and waters and islands and ports than Istachi, whose maps covered territorial land terrain. Eventually, however, the most important map of that manuscript is this one. This is a map of the world with south at the top. As we've seen, this is common in Islamic maps, not all maps. Very strange. Europe is too large than we should expect. Asia is condensed, and the prominent source of the Nile is at the top. The map is not only very strange, but also it has one feature that makes it one of the most important world maps of pre-modern times. And the discovery of it, one of the most important cartographic discoveries in recent decades. Just at the top of the map, on the right-hand side, to the right of the source of the Nile in Africa, we have a scale. The scale has numbers in abjad numerals, which indicate degrees. This is the earliest extant world map to carry a scale. The numbers are finely executed. They don't mean anything here. They shouldn't run to 180 in the middle of the map. They should run only to 90. No, it is not a plotted map, but it indicates that this copy was made based on a prototype in which there was some plotting. And this completely changes our understanding of how late antique and early Islamic cartographers worked. Finally, I want to talk about Al-Idrisi, the most famous Muslim cartographer, and I think the most sophisticated cartographer of the medieval world in general. Al-Idrisi was a princely scholar who probably was born and definitely lived in Sicily under the Norman ruler of Palermo in the 12th century. Because Sicily, as we've just seen, was under the Muslim control until 1072, it continued to be a place where Arab learning thrived. In his own work, Al-Idrisi tells us that he was asked to prepare a world map on a silver disc for display purposes. We have, in the beginning of Idrisi's works, we have several of copies of his books. We have this circular world map, very beautiful. I believe this circular world map may be a paper copy of the disc for display that he was asked to make for Roger, the king of Sicily. However, others, including my colleague Emily Saville-Smith and Tony Campbell in a recent blog, claim that this is not by Al-Idrisi at all, that this is a later addition. What we do know for certain is that Al-Idrisi produced the book with text and maps, and the text and maps are organized by 70 regions, by a mathematical grid he divides the known world into 7 climes, latitudinal climes from the equator northward. So the equator here is at the north, and then you go, sorry, the equator here is at the top, and you go northwards and you go down. Each latitudinal climb is divided into 10 equally sized squares. So you have 70 squares in the grid. Now, El-Idrisi himself doesn't put all these 70 maps next to each other. In the surviving copies of his work, we have only each of these maps is in a separate place in the volume, in the codex. His approach here is astounding. There's nothing as sophisticated to that from the medieval period before we come to the plotted maps of the 15th century in Europe. So this, just to emphasize, this is clearly what you see here is a modern compilation of the maps from BN manuscript and British Library manuscript. So when Idrisi takes the grid for Sicily, which lies in the 4th climb in the 2nd section, that is the second most westmost part of the climb, he shows us Sicily not like Istachi, not as a perfect circle, not like the Book of Curiosities as a kind of an oval, but we have here an attempt to reproduce the triangularity of Sicily, and a much more attempt to reproduce coastal lines. Idrisi, like the author of the Book of Curiosities, is very interested in waterways, in sailing, in coastal lines. And he knows, of course, a lot about Sicily. He knows about all of the known world, to be honest. He has maps of all these areas from China to the west. But for Arab Muslim mapmaker, he is, of course, very well informed about Europe, mainly through sailors and diplomats who came to the court in Palermo. So right at the top at the bottom of the map, that is at the extreme north, he has a map of central and northern England. It's very empty, as you can imagine, because since all these squares are of equal size, then places that have nothing in there, like Siberia or Scotland, are empty. This is in a way a waste of space. Modern atlases would usually have a different scale from places that are empty. But he uses the same scale. This is not a plotted map, but in his mind, this is the same scale. So we have here Scotland as a strange peninsula coming at the bottom of Britain. We have this strange elongated island north of England, which is perhaps Iceland. And then we have this place in central England called Rapoport in Arabic, which is, of course, Oxford, where the map ended up. And then the knowledge of the lands of the Franks is very good as well. And you have here Ibris, Paris, located very nicely on an island within the Seine. And you have many other places in the land of the Franks, in the land of the Almans, of the Germans as well. And at the bottom of the map, you have the southern part of Britain facing the lands of the Franks, and you have the places like Hastings, and of course Londres, just at the bottom there. The information here is derived almost certainly from a French-speaking sailor who traveled to parts along the coast of England at some part. I want to finish off by saying that we have now, over the last decade, our understanding of the history of Islamic maps has changed tremendously. Until 10 years ago, if you wanted to read about Islamic maps, you had to go to the General Survey of the History of Cartography that really came out in the early 90s and was not a monograph dedicated to Islamic maps. In the last 10 years, or even less, we have 6 new books. As a general introduction, I recommend my own as a kind of survey, but there are books, Zed and Trim book on Trim's on mapping the Middle East, compares the medieval representations with modern representation using some of the time of maps that Nick Krebs talked about earlier for understanding how colonial maps changed the view of the Middle East and how it compared to the maps that came from within the Middle East through the medieval and the early modern period. And all these books are highly recommended. And now a student or anyone who wants to really read about Islamic maps can really see it for see analysis as well as the wonderful ability to view all these images through digital methods, through the Bodleian Library and others. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yossef, thank you very, very much for this really fascinating presentation. Sarah, have we any questions?
Yes. Yes, we have. May I remind all the attendees to please write the questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A, so it's easier for me just to filter them out. So one question is, it seems that tube maps can be successfully used for traveling as they map fixed itineraries. Can one consider that it was more or less the same in the case of the Al-Isarkri map? And pardon my pronunciation, I don't know Arabic, thank you.
Yes, they are very good. The pronunciation is perfect and the question is absolutely right. Yes, I think the maps of Isarkri show itineraries. They have lines. I think you can see it in the map here, where you see some of the lines. You can see it also on the map of the Book of Curiosities. The lines of the itineraries are similar to the lines of the tube. They tell the one who uses the map, who usually wouldn't take the map with him, but who is planning a journey, where to go. And now, if one uses this map, one can go through one line of itinerary, but one has also a sense, unlike a linear text, you can also describe an itinerary through a text. But unlike a text, you can also see that you have another line to your left, and you can possibly, if this road is not available or you want to change, you have a spatial understanding of where these little lines are in relation to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question we have is from Julian, who asks, what is the difference between the Book of Entertainment and the Book of Curiosities?
I guess the question, if I understand it correctly, the question is, are these maps for entertainment? Are these maps for practical? And question of marvels and curiosities as well. Yeah, I think these maps originally, in all cases, were not just for entertainment. They were attempts to represent the world in a way that would be useful for an elite audience of either merchants or political elites. There also were often there was an attempt to make them appealing aesthetically, but I think they were meant to be practical. Later copies often had a nostalgic view of these, and therefore, especially in the case of Istachi, you see a growing attempts to really emphasize the aesthetic elements of the maps rather than the practical, because they were no longer practical. They were better maps that represent reality better. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you. A question: colors. It says the colors, captions, and legends of medieval Islamic maps seemed very vivid in visual, bright and glorious in colors, able to withstand the elements of nature for thousands of years. What was the ink used to create these early beautiful maps of Islamic world?
I don't have a technical answer about the specific inks, but I would say that in many of these cases, we have some touching. So, for example, the maps of the Book of Curiosities, you see that the blue and the green on the map that you see here and the title of Lost of the Map of the Caliph, they have been touched in later centuries. So these are not the 13th century pigments. But definitely when you see the copy of Idrisi, the map that is used, and then others here, I think there is an attempt to make it vivid. Whether it, there's a good question about whether it is intended for posterity. It's definitely intended to catch the eye, and to, of course, as with any map, the fact that you have contrasting colors makes it far easier for the user to discern the different elements of the map. But questions about posterity is really interesting. I don't have an answer.
Thank you. Another question is, are there extant Islamic maps or any other support but paper?
Any other support? But paper.
Apart from
yes,
paper.
Thank you. Yes. Not from the medieval period, until 1500, the period I'm working on, there is no extant maps surviving. One could consider a map of the sky or representation of the sky found on the ceiling of one of the Umayyad 8th century Umayyad fortifications or small castles in the desert. But it is not of a terrestrial. We do know that the Fatimids had made a fantastic silk map that was hung on in the Fatimid palace. And as I mentioned, El-Idrisi says that he prepared a silver disc representation of the wall that was for public display. So yeah, simply it was not it is not survived as far as we know. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 1 minute and many questions. So one is, do we know what is the function of the first scale on the map? It is not for measurement.
Yeah, I think that after a long research, our conclusion, Emily, Savile Smith, and myself, is that the scale on this world map that survives on a map made in the 11th century is a copy of a world map made probably in late antiquity. So there was a world map based on what we call Ptolemaic ideas of plotting coordinates, based on Ptolemy to some degree. But in the 11th century, the author of the Book of Curiosities didn't actually use the scale to plot the map, but rather copied the scale as part of copying the map. And there was this connection between the actual way the map looks and the scale that was also copied. Originally, we believe that it was used for plotting, at least to a degree. Thank you.
Thank you. We have several more questions, but I don't think that unfortunately we have the time now for answering them live. I will put Yossef in touch with you directly. Thank you.
Thank you once again for all your questions. Both talks have really raised people's interests, and it's not enough time, unfortunately, for all these questions. So please, as Sarah said, do get in contact with the speakers if you wanted have follow-on discussion on any points that may have been raised in their presentations. Thanks again, Yossef, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take just under a half an hour break now, a comfort break, and then we're going to resume